Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Foundation for Integrated Transport's webinar on rail, the case for rail. It's great to have you with us this afternoon, just about this afternoon. So the purpose of these webinars is to showcase some of the great work funded by the Foundation for Integrated Transport by FIT, and to discuss some of the key transport issues and solutions. And we're very excited to have one today on rail. Rail's the backbone of the transport network, enabling large numbers of people to be moved efficiently and offering the best opportunity to replace longer distance car trips and short haul flights with low carbon travel. But I'm sure many of us will have familiar anecdotes with the issues facing the UK rail network, where in places it's overcrowded, it can be expensive, it can be unreliable, and in many places it suffers from years of underinvestment and fragmentation. We've got a lot of promise at the moment with the new oversight body, Great British Rail, but we haven't yet seen that come forward with any significant reforms. And the new government has pledged to renationalise nearly all of the passenger rail services in the next 5 years. But we really want to see what difference that's going to make to people's lives. And that's a little bit about what we're here to discuss today. So my name is Martin Clark. I'm a trustee with the Foundation for Integrated Transport. Delighted to be chairing this session today. So we're going to be exploring the case for rail. And I'm delighted also to be joined by Michael Solomon-Williams from the Campaign for Better Transport, by Jim Steer from Greengage 21, Georgia Gurra, who's a fellow with the Foundation for Integrated Transport, Rosie Allen from Green Alliance, and Gary Shipp from the Community Rail Network. Just to share a few brief slides before we get started. Try and make this work. There we go. And yeah, so these are a few of the Foundation for Integrated Transport priorities. It's really all about, I'm just going to actually, but a little bit before that, background. Simon Norton set up the Foundation for Integrated Transport in 2014. He was a world-class mathematician at Cambridge University, and kind of made famous a little bit by a book that was written about him called The Genius in My Basement, which I recommend going and looking up. But he was also a renowned, avid transport campaigner, having a really, really strong vision for transport as a human right, particularly a means to get around without a car. And that's really what FIT is all about. And that's kind of built into FIT's priorities in terms of the work that it supports, trying to shift attitudes towards private car and transforming public transport provision, better opportunities for walking and cycling, and supporting grassroots community action, promoting sustainable travel, and not just focusing on road building. We do this for a range of means. We primarily are a grant-giving organisation, but we also have some social investment that we give out, and we offer a range of fellowships to further our knowledge and expertise in the subject. These are a few of the organisations that we've supported through our work, and we're going to hear some more from people today. So that's a little bit about, very, very, very briefly about the Foundation for Integrated Transport, but that's, I think, more than enough from me. I want to crack straight on with the presentations. Basically, what we're going to do is run through the talks, and then we'll have a bit more time for questions and discussion at the end. And if you want to feed in your comments and your questions to the chat, to the comments, they'll be passed through when we can put them through to the panel later in the session. But to move straight on, I'd like to welcome again Michael Solomon-Williams from Campaign for Better Transport, and he's going to speak about some of the key routes to a better rail network. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Martin, and good morning all. I am now sharing my screen, and you can see the slide. I'm seeing my slideshow there. Very fast and further. Looking good? Super. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm the head of campaigns at Campaign for Better Transport. It's a great pleasure to be here today to discuss the case for rail. And why we're here? Well, the case very much needs to be made. So thank you very much to FIT for convening this vital webinar. I'm delighted to be sharing the session with Jim and Georgia and look forward to hearing from them shortly. Meanwhile, let's have a look at why the case needs to be made at all, and then take a look at some of the work that we at Campaign for Better Transport have been doing in this space. So here's the National Travel Survey published this year. It looked at last year's data and confirms that just 2% of trips were made by rail. When Network Rail's budget is £43 billion agreed to cover CP7, it's Control Period 7, set against the Road Investment Strategy 2 being just over half of that total for roads at £29 billion, with risk 3 still to be determined, one might almost understand why some complain of drivers getting an unfair slice of the government pie. So why do such levels of investment not lead to a higher mode share, particularly in a climate emergency, when it's vital that rail should form a far greater proportion of journeys? In the past, we've identified small towns as transport deserts, those settlements with populations between 5 and 30,000 pounds, which are in many cases cut off completely from the rail network. Many of those, of course, have been further isolated by bus cuts, which we won't cover in detail today. But the key point here is that this is a quarter of the UK's population who are often simply unable to get to a station. For the lucky few who can, they better not form another quarter of the population who have disability or mobility impairment of any sort, as 3 out of 4 stations lack proper step-free access. And then only 2% of stations have level boarding from platform to train. Here's the fantastic Merseyrail, an outstanding exception with full level boarding at all of their stations, to their beautiful standard 777 trains, if any of you are lucky enough to go on those. That's really an exception. So there are 3 huge barriers to accessing the network in the first place: having a station within reach and integrated transport to get you there, having step-free access to that station, and having level boarding to the train. Level boarding, I should say, is a key enabler. On top of wheelchair users and mobility impaired, those with prams, suitcases, the elderly, the young, and tentative first-time users, huge swathes of the population are all affected and prevented from accessing the existing network. In the meantime, the entire Dutch rail network will be level boarding by 2030. Well, at current rates, it will take the UK 100 years just to sort step-free access, with no plans in place for level boarding to be addressed systemically. So something political will. But what else gets in the way of people using the existing network? Cost, of course. We know that rail fares are simply too high and have been getting higher at a disproportionate rate. It is, of course, to all of us here, I'm sure, a topsy-turvy world in which the cost of taking the most sustainable form of transport seems to rise as dramatically as the present danger of the climate emergency, rather than be used as a direct lever to address that issue. But this is the reality we live with, and the key reason why we need to make the case for rail. And that we do. We've certainly been calling for action on rail fares for a very long time, and the annual rail fares rise, both its announcement and its implementation, has become a bit like Christmas for us. That is, if Christmas is something you don't look forward to, but is an inevitable part of life. Nevertheless, it needn't be this way. The annual rise, it has to be emphasised, is not inevitable. It's a Treasury choice to set the rise at or around the retail price index. Now, we do now know that, hooray for small mercies, it is likely to be pegged at the consumer price index by 2030. We've called for that for some time, so this is a small victory, but really it's basically fiddling while Rome burns. That's why we're calling for a fares freeze, and we will be reaffirming this call with bells on in 2025, as a major opportunity has been missed in the new government's first budget to make the case for rail very, very clearly. Because yes, rail fares will go up above inflation next year, while surprising many who saw that the new government had an opportunity to finally address the issue, the Chancellor chose to do nothing about the fuel duty freeze, nor to address Rishi Sunak's 5p cut to fuel duty. And no, we weren't impressed by that. Doing the BBC's live coverage on Budget Day, I was glad that the final 2 words I got to use were climate emergency. A particularly odd detail in the budget was the decision to increase the price of most rail cards by £5 from £30 to £35 next year. Alongside the 50% increase in the fare cap, these decisions on the cost of rail travel do raise questions about quite how seriously government appreciates that rail must be at the forefront of a fight against climate change. Not just a nice to have, perhaps gradually decarbonised. Some announcements on infrastructure investments, such as East West Rail and West Yorkshire Mass Transit, were certainly welcome. These weren't new announcements. As the issue of rail fares is so key, in autumn 2023, we published an extensive report, Fair Future, a blueprint for rail fares and ticketing reform, containing 16 key recommendations to sort out the range of issues that face current and potential rail passengers. These are subdivided into 3 categories: better value, simpler ticketing, and easier booking. We now chair a quarterly working group with the Department for Transport, GBRTT, Rail Delivery Group, independent rail retailers, and all the key stakeholders in the rail ticketing space. Therefore, we balance supportive diplomacy and policy development with clear public campaigning. And we've already had at least one recommendation be adopted by the new government, namely best price guarantee, which Labour had included in their plan to fix Britain's railways. So our pre-election influencing had a clear impact. Meanwhile, keeping on top of short-term developments affecting rail travellers, we stepped in to save the London Day Travel Guide. Of course, that's not just for Londoners, but for those visiting London, and is used annually by 14 million people a year. We need more, not less, integrated ticketing. So using this integrated card, which offers significant discounts for rail users, would have been the wrong signal at the wrong time. We mobilised our supporters, engaged local authorities and county councils around London, then got the key stakeholders, that's the Department for Transport, the Rail Delivery Group and Transport for London, around the table, sorting out a resolution. In 51 years of campaigning, having made the case back in the 1970s for integrated ticketing in the first place, this counts as one of our biggest successes. And what about faster? Well, the pace of our activities has certainly increased over recent months and years. I would say that it has been very busy indeed. And we're at the forefront of looking out for the rail industry and its workforce. With the risk of one of the UK's principal train factories, that's Litchurch Lane in Derby, closing down this year, in March, we wrote to the Transport Secretary at the time, Mark Harpen, calling for action. Labour followed us 2 weeks later, late than never, and the now Prime Minister admitted the government was too slow to act. We remain focused on working with the Railway Industry Association in particular to make the case for consistent rolling stock strategy and pipeline of orders at Litchurch Lane and beyond. We also took action on Royal Mail in defence of the rail freight sector, and we'll be making the case for more, not less, freight on rail, working closely with the freight operating companies, the unions and large retailers, including a collaboration with Great British Railways on a retailer accreditation programme in the mould of fair trade. Long-term, effective, sustainable delivery, combining rail freight with last-mile e-bikes and e-vans, consolidated rather than fragmented, should be faster for a nation of impatient internet shoppers, so we all stand to gain. We brought together the Rail Freight Group, along with the Transport Action Network also, to make the case for vital rail freight upgrades to be prioritised over road projects, in particular the Lower Thames Crossing, which is effectively a pre-1994 style relic of an age before induced demand was widely understood. And we put out a policy position paper proposing solutions to the debacle of HS2, including Jim Steer's recommendation to include ensure that Birmingham to Crewe is included, at the very least. And we found time for a jam-packed Better Transport Week, which launched at Wolverhampton Station, where integration is happening thanks to West Midlands Metro extending to that. And indeed, Gary Shipp spoke fantastically at a community event we held there. Overall, as well as being fairer and urging government to move faster in acting, we need the network to reach much further than presently. So it's great that our expanding the railways guidance has had an impact, and that we could celebrate the amazing Dartmoor line, which has been an outstanding success on passenger numbers and has doubled its return on investment after that programme. We are excited about the Northumberland line, which will be opening later this year, and driver training is currently underway for that line. But we have in fact needed to make the case to restore Restoring Your Railways, which was sadly cut earlier this year, another curious decision. Finally, international rail. We believe that there are a great many long-distance journeys made by plane, which could and should be made by train, but that there is simply not sufficient recognition of the potential mode shift offered by international rail. Earlier this year, we urged the England men's football team to take the train to Euro 2024 and inspired a Europe-wide campaign from Transport and Environment with 15 countries involved. Last week, in fact, we shared a roundtable with the key stakeholders in this space. That's including Transport, HS1, GetLink, Eurostar, Eurotunnel, and Network Rail. And that's feeding into the report we're putting out next year. DfT representatives have given us useful indications of effective areas of policy focus, and it is clear that there is will and skill in the industry, but a substantial gap both in the political focus and the public voice. A survey we carried out earlier this year garnered the highest response of its kind that we've ever had, and our initial government recommendations are being developed through our work with stakeholders, industry, governments, and crucially the public into a report and enhanced focus next year. That's all for now. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Michael, and super punctual as well, which is apt for a rail talk. Thank you. So we'll go straight on. We'll take questions a little bit later. So we'll go straight on to Jim Steer from Greengage 21, and I'm going to try and share Jim's presentation. So welcome, Jim.
Thanks,
Almost
Martin.
click the leave button, and that would be a mistake.
Yeah. Good morning, well, good afternoon, everybody, and great to be able to follow on from Michael's great run through there. Thank you very much. This is the first slide. I'm going to be speaking about a very specific focus area, a project that was actually commissioned from Greengage 21 by Greenpeace UK, and it was great to see them stepping into this area and showing such an interest. And Foundation for Integrated Transport, thank you very much for co-funding this work, which involved quite a bit of digging into the evidence and data around the piece. So the question that we were set was, is there a case in Britain for doing what's happening evidently in many countries in Europe, which is to adopt what's generically known as a climate card. So that was the exam question was, well, could we do the same thing in Britain? And if so, what would it look like? And the report was published a couple of months ago. So next slide, please. That's the report cover on the right. The important thing I think to mention here is, yeah, that was the exam question. What can be learned from Europe's experience with climate cards? And we were concerned, therefore, to look at both the successes and, has to be said, some mistakes, and if you like, some failures in the application of this. So we were very keen to look at all of that, and I should credit my co-authors of this work from Albion Economics and Tony Duckenfield, who's an expert in rail travel perception behavior change from and his little company is called Beyond Logic. So some really brainy people on this exercise, making it worth doing. Next slide. So the great thing about climate cards is they do exactly what it says here. They simplify the complexity of rail ticketing. And I think really this is the most important point of the this little presentation and of this report. There's clearly a turn-off to travel by rail and by extension public transport because of the sheer complexity of the rail fare system. And there's a loss of confidence and trust in the rail system arising from that. I mean, Michael in his run through talked about reliability and so on, which is also a hugely deterrent factor, but actually having a fare system that's so complicated, it is obviously not helping. What climate cards do is kind of sidestep all of that with a very simple thing. This is your monthly alternative. And of course, it has that advantage of appealing to people who are currently put off rail travel, so car users and so on, with the wider environmental benefits that brings. So just stress here, fares is a devolved matter. We probably all know that rail travel in the UK, in Britain, is very dominated by London. I mean, 2/3 of rail travel in Britain is to or from or within London. Is quite extraordinary. London dominates in many things, but probably in rail most of all. But for Wales and Scotland, it'd be for them to decide, well, do they want to join in something like this in the first place? So next slide, please. The challenges we'd been set really by Greenpeace UK were around would we have enough capacity on the rail system? You put in the superb offer like has happened in Europe. Could the rail system cope with it? Really important question, the capacity question. To which we added, yeah, and could we afford it? What would be the impact on revenues? So this is basically, let's be clear what this is. This is a monthly subscription-based payment system. This is rather like how most people pay for mobile phone usage, for internet charges, and for streaming services on TV and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of contemporary familiarity with this way of paying. It's a monthly charge. You sign up, you pay for it, and you can opt out at any stage, of course. In Europe, remarkably, everybody opted for the same price. They said, well, we'll go for 49 euros a month for this. That started in Austria, was followed suit in Germany. There was an attempt to follow suit in France. They rather rushed it and made a bit of a mess of it, quite honestly. Hungary has followed suit, so has Portugal. So we sort of simply said, well, okay, let's test this out. And so far as we're able to, in this kind of preliminary work, looking at a £49 per month card, which would entitle you to travel on rail anywhere in the country, with some exclusions. And the exclusions really followed what had happened in Germany in the first instance. They picked out and excluded their fast intercity and high-speed trains and said, well, you can't use it on that. Why? To protect their revenue base. We also reckon, so we followed suit with our testing of Fare Britannia application in Britain. We also said, well, actually for London, we're going to need a supplement. Otherwise, the level of abstraction of fares is going to be very high. So that's kind of quite critical, really, as part of this. How do you make it affordable? You're probably going to have some exclusions, which immediately upset some people. But hey, we're looking at the experience in Europe and seeing how it would apply. Bottom point there is rather important. This doesn't mean to say you couldn't travel long distance from, say, Liverpool to Euston, which I did yesterday on what we would think of as an intercity train. There are also interregional services, actually an extraordinary number of them. They're not branded as such. In Germany, they are the Interregio network. So the idea would be that you could travel around anywhere, just not on what you might think of as premium services, intercity services, basically to try to reduce the extent of down trading from what are, of course, very expensive tickets down to this climate card, Fare Britannia proposed name. Next slide, please. So what was the experience in Germany? Well, the really exciting thing in Germany, I think, is that headline number in the first sort of bullet point there. The passenger volumes on their regional trains and the map on the right shows lines with substantial increases, really right across the company. It's a bit hard to see, but I mean that's the whole of Germany there, and really happened right across the country. 28% increase is really a very, very big number, and most of these are on local and regional services. They're primarily being bought by people who commute. Couple of points. In Germany, really capacity is not too much of a challenge. Commuter train services into the cities of Germany tend to have 5 or 10 car trains, very often bi-level trains, a lot of capacity. But they did also get quite heavy levels of abstraction. In other words, abstracting revenue from people who are already traveling by train and they said, thanks very much, I'll get myself a Deutschland ticket, as the German card is known. That said, 8% of the ticket holders are new to rail, which is really quite significant. So our challenge was really to work out, obviously in a pretty preliminary way, what would happen with this applied in Britain. Next slide, please. We had one thing that really did help to look at, and that was the London travel card. I mean, if you look in Britain and say, well, where has anybody done anything like this? Okay, this is London, it's the London region, blah, 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 but it's hugely important for rail travel as well as bus and tube. And fortunately, Malcolm Fairhurst at Transport for London, or London Regional Transport as then was, did some very detailed research into this, because what you need to extract is the question of fare level changes from fares integration. All of the station-to-station fares across London disappeared eventually. It was a step-by-step process. And what we deduced from that was that the impact of fares integration across the modes, and there's no reason why a climate card couldn't be and shouldn't be across the modes, and applicable on this basis where you've got a card rather than you're paying a fare each time. You'll see there a huge increase actually in passenger miles on the London Underground network. So I think we know that simplification works. It's just rather chilling actually to think how long that process, which started in the beginning of the first Ken Livingstone regime, took to get to the stage it's at today, or even a couple of years ago. I mean, it's a long-term program. So that's a cautionary part of the tale, I think. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Can I just ask you to start wrapping up?
Sure. Yeah. There are two key challenges to overcome. Capacity problem, would there be a reduction in rail revenue? Next slide, please. Capacity, we think there are a huge number of measures that can be taken that are affordable. It's true the network is full at some places, but longer trains are basically the way forward, we feel. And next slide, please. And I think this is the penultimate one. This just shows the revenue impact. And the bottom line there, we've got a couple of cases. The impact overall on rail revenue could be as little as a loss of 40, 50 million a year. I say that's quite small, but it could be quite a lot bigger. It could be £500 million because of this abstraction point rather than generation. That's what you're trading off. So next slide, please. Some support campaign for better transport's always thought that there's scope for this. Mark Smith of the well-known travel website made the comment you can see there, really picking up on how radically better this could be. And next slide, please. Which just shows a comment from the Daily Telegraph, which did look at this. And unlike the rail press, who reacted rather coolly to this, the rail technical press saying, well, you need lots of fares in Britain. They sort of said, well, this could work. So last slide, I think, is, I think we're there. So I think the real point out of there then is to remember that our rail fare system is designed to maximize revenue. So if you change it in this radical way, you're going to have to tackle the fallout for that. And that's obviously a big challenge. We'd hope that Great British Railways will be asked to do that. We've got a new government that's looking for new ideas, and I'm very keen to hear what your comments and questions are. Thank you for your help, Martin.
Thank you very much, Jim. Really interesting. I'm going to move straight on. Welcome Georgia Gura, who's a fellow with the Foundation for Integrated Transport. So welcome, Georgia.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks to FIT for inviting me here today and for the opportunity of this fellowship, and great to follow on from such authoritative colleagues. I'm going to share a few slides. So I'm still at the early stages of my fellowship, so this is going to be more of a sort of talking you through the project and the what we will be looking at, rather than the outcomes that I hope there'll be an opportunity to share in due course. So in my research, I'm going to look at the relationship between the environmental and wider socioeconomic benefits in the rail investment case appraisal. So I will be looking into whether now it is the right time for this to start carrying a stronger weight in rail investment appraisals. So I think I would say that the importance of this research stems from how crucial the social license to operate a railway is, and how the environment and the socioeconomic benefits are linked to that quite crucially. So where the sort of idea and inspiration for this research comes from is that, you know, we all know there is sort of overwhelming data around how rail is by far the cleanest mode of transport and the environmental benefits that it can bring. Just to give an example, it is known that today rail accounts for a 1.4 share of transport CO2 emissions, whilst accounting for 9.5% of passenger kilometers. And this is the data that is, you know, that is available today. We know this is happening today, but obviously research suggests that, you know, as we deepen and move faster with investment in the rail network, the environmental benefits will largely increase even further. So, well, it is very well known that, for example, reducing road and air congestion through modal shift will reduce emissions. Estimates suggest that by 2050, electric trains, as new technology advances, are expected to produce 14 times fewer emissions than conventionally fueled trains. And you know, furthermore, if we go even further, if all train services were electric in 2050 and these new technologies were fully active and available, emissions would be expected to decrease by a further 85%. I mean, I think this is pretty impressive data. So as someone who in her career has been involved in both writing and appraising business cases and investment case, I thought I would look into how this relates to the way the business case guidance is written, the way that environment is treated in business case guidance. There are a few ways in which the Treasury Green Book and business case guidance treats environmental benefits. And they are, don't need to go into a lot of detail on this, but, you know, for example, the value of carbon, which, you know, I would argue is possibly underweighted today, the environmental capital, which is basically the negative impact that happens through, for example, the delivery of new infrastructure, the construction process, etc. And there is a very specific section in business case guidance as to how to mitigate negative environmental impact of infrastructure projects, rather than focusing on how to deliver desired environmental outcomes. The desired environmental outcomes are at the moment part of a broader strategic case, so it part of a broader set of parameters. And one of the things that I will be looking into is that the right way to treat the environmental case, particularly for, you know, for projects that we know will deliver great environmental benefits. Environmental benefits are also monetized in the economic case, but not without challenge. And this is something else I'll be looking to. And we know that the guidance on accounting for the broader effects of climate change, which does not only apply to rail transport projects, but to all infrastructure projects delivered by government, was last updated in 2020. So there's probably potential for a review of that. And so combining all these few bits that I've discussed, I've come to what will be my sort of research question, exam question. And I would like to talk about, if we are serious about decarbonisation, should the value of carbon be increased in Treasury investment case appraisal guidance? And similarly, is it not now the time for the desired environmental outcomes to carry a stronger weight in business case appraisal, rather than focusing on how we offset the carbon emissions given from construction, for example? Or we know that environmental benefits are connected to wider socioeconomic benefits of rail. For example, I'm thinking about if we improve, biodiversity in an area, if we improve air quality, what does that do to that community and to the people that live in the area, for example? So could we bring this link to the forefront in business case appraisal? And finally, is there anything that we can learn from devolved administrations and other more forward-leaning nations as to how they manage the case for environment in rail projects and planning? Is there anything that they do differently that we can probably look into and adopt if we think there's good value in that? So as I said, this was just going to be a quick sort of project presentation, and I hope that was helpful, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Georgia. Again, we're going to crack on with questions, hopefully after we've finished the speakers. So I know time isn't on our side, but we'll crack on with Rosie from Green Alliance now. So welcome, Rosie.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks to all the speakers today. It's been really interesting. I just wanted to start by endorsing what everyone's been saying this afternoon, which is that it's going to be essential to get more people to travel by rail in order to tackle transport's emissions. At Green Alliance, we know from our previous work on modal shift that even with the zero emission vehicle mandates progress of getting electric vehicles into the fleet, we're still going to need to reduce car miles in order to meet carbon budgets over the next few years. This probably will require some tax reform, but first I'd argue that we need to ensure we're putting in place the building blocks of a thriving public transport system so people have convenient, viable alternatives to car travel. And so that's what we've been talking about today. Thanks to Michael, I really admire Campaign for Better Transport's work on the fair future for rail and the support for alleviating regional inequality when it comes to who can access rail where in the country, and on the measures that can improve accessibility of the rail network. I think it's so important that while we work on envisaging a greener transport future, we don't exclude or isolate those with disabilities from that vision. Jim, that was also really powerful to see the impact of fare simplification and the potential solutions to problems with capacity. We know it's worth repeating that the Treasury keeping car travel artificially low while rising the price of rail tickets will hamper people choosing train over car. And thank you to Georgia. It was really interesting to hear about your upcoming work, revisiting the way we appraise transport infrastructure in the future. We need a new approach that reflects the need for increased public transport that doesn't continue to deliver car dependence through what we build and where we build it. We're currently working with some funding from Foundation for Integrated Transport and Trainline to look at some similar measures to encourage travelling by train over car that we've heard from this afternoon. I'm also really interested in supporting a modal shift target. We've heard from Louise Hay that we're more likely to see a rail growth target than a car reduction target, though we were promised modal shift targets to be set in this parliament. We're interested in exploring getting government backing for the Rail and Urban Transport Review to target doubling the mode share for passenger rail. I'm also interested in exploring some fare simplification measures or solutions to affordability, but also enabling regional leaders to experiment with integrated ticketing, as we're seeing in Greater Manchester's B network at the moment. I'm also interested in looking at where open access operators can help with capacity strain on our existing network. And I'm interested in how we can improve accessibility to stations and trains, as we've talked about already. I'm also interested in improving rail connectivity in areas that are underserved, such as the Midlands and the North, all while keeping the pressure up on rail electrification in the background. While that doesn't have as much of an emissions impact as shifting car journeys to rail, and we don't want to confuse the messaging that getting the train is already a green option as trains are, I think it's important that we just continue banging the drum on electrifying our train lines. And so excited to move to some Q&A and hear from others. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rosie. And finally, Gary Ship, Community Rail Network.
Thank you, Martin, and pleasure to follow on from such esteemed speakers. I was just reflecting, actually, I was at an event yesterday celebrating the 20th anniversary of one of the Community Rail Partner members, Sevenside, and speaker there said, really resonated with me. Transport's not about getting people from A to B. It's an enabler of life opportunities. I think sometimes we lose our sense of that when we're talking about the practicalities of cost, convenience, etc., that actually all we need to do as a transport network is to deliver people where they want to get to, in the way that works best for them. We often use the analogy of it's a jigsaw, but it's a blank jigsaw. Every area is different, everybody is different, and the reasons why they may not be able to use the train could be manifold. It could be to do with cost, it could be to do with accessibility, it could be that they don't have an option for getting to the station in the first place, because remembering that all rail users are also users of other transport as well. So we need to be thinking bigger picture, and I feel quite positive at the moment with the new music coming from the new UK government. The stars, I wouldn't say they're aligning just yet, but they're certainly moving. I think this is possibly a once in a generational opportunity to get the right people having the right conversations, to get the priorities in place and to get the policies to support them as well. As Community Rail Network, we are very much, as you would imagine, advocates of the community-based approach. Yeah, we need to be understanding local people's local needs. Community Rail acts as a bridge between the rail industry and local communities, as a friendly face, a helping hand for other sectors of transport to just try and think about the local situation. Communities, they know the answer, they know the solutions to what they need, and we need to be having those conversations. How we can enable that is to just make sure that it's front and centre of the new government's approach to the national transport strategy, and through the rail reform that's taking place at the moment. There's many different angles, but I'm just pleased to say that the four pillars that underpin the community rail framework very much align with the new government's strategic priorities for the DfT. So we feel that things are travelling in the right direction at the moment, and we're looking forward to seeing what comes out the other end. Thank you very much to FIT for funding my post over the past 4.5 months. We've been busy promoting providing opportunities for our members to share ideas, best practice, things that's happening on the ground, learn from each other's experiences as well. We're looking forward to carrying that work on in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting hearing you all, and thank you for coming and taking part. We've got plenty of questions coming through, but I just want to start off by drawing us back to the theme of the session, thinking about the case for rail. And many of you know I'm a massive fan of travelling by train, of trains generally, but given that rail projects and investing in rail tends to be a costly and time-consuming business, and there's a tendency to benefit a relatively small number of quite well-off people through investing in rail compared to investing in other modes, or there has been. Why should this be a priority for us?
Happy to take that. Is it? Are we jumping in? Yeah. Well, a line we often use is if 1 in 10 uses the rail network, 10 out of 10 benefit from it. I think it's always worth remembering that. And the key one, if ever we have to make the argument about funding priorities, as I mentioned at the start, rail, as you alluded to, has a greater investment on CP7 as nearly twice RIS 2 and what RIS 3 will be. Of course, it's everybody benefits primarily if you're thinking about congestion. There's the congestion reduction side of things. But of course, I mean, I think the case for rail needs to lead from the environmental perspective. It really does. I mean, it's our front line in terms of tackling climate emergency. So I think, we could almost congestion reduction, which does matter to everybody. It's almost a sort of small provincial issue in relation to the climate emergency. So I think that's absolutely key. And as Rosie alluded to, in terms of carbon budgets, that side of things does need to be over to George's presentation on that side of things. That really there's a stronger case that can be made for investing more. Certainly, I mean, it's not all about investment. I think that that there's efficient use of the funds that we have, and we haven't necessarily talked yet in detail about rail reform and GDR. And I know I didn't have that necessarily in my presentation, but I think there's an opportunity, and this is something which the Secretary of State is keen on, to look at efficiencies in a sense, and more efficiently using the funds that are available to people that are working in the industry. So I think we can do both. We can justify current levels of investment and ask for more, but at the same time use the money we have better. And certainly, I know that she's very, very keen. We haven't talked trams yet, but the integration piece, I said from Gary, integrated transport strategy is very, very exciting. Gary Williams is heading up there. We know Louise Haigh is keen to roll out more tram networks, urban tram networks, more affordably. And this pertains to HS2, which is almost like a kind of sort of a macro case study of everything that's been wrong with the approach to transport over the last few decades. It's an official process of that doesn't give transport funding a good name whatsoever. But that's Christian Walmer has called it transport policy done on a whim. So we need to sort of challenge the people who say that's too much money to spend on rail. Nevertheless, make it clear that money is required, because that's the key point. It's our front line against the climate emergency.
Great, thank you. And Rosie?
Yeah, I would just come in and say, also from the emissions perspective, emissions reductions perspective, it's just those long distance leisure trips which can be such a huge source of emissions. So if we're able to replace some of those international travel cases as well as domestic long distance leisure travel, you can displace a lot of emissions through those rail journeys. And there will be some journeys where it's more appropriate to invest in bus services and trams, as Michael alluded to. But for where we can use rail, it just can shift those long journeys, which we really need to do if we're going to meet carbon budgets.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right to lead on all of these environmental benefits that rail brings. But I think there is a really important economic benefit not to lose sight of. If you don't have a rail network, you can't make cities function. Now, it might be light rail systems, but typically in this country, we've got rail networks serving city centres. They need to be improved. It's where investment really needs to go, because some of the networks really now pretty busy. But the investment needs to be made probably in the approaches to the big city stations, some of which have not been improved. So, you can't grow city economies, which traditionally are focused on city centres, unless you can get people there. And the comparative studies of Britain and countries across Europe is this is an economic structural weakness. We just don't get enough people into our city centres. And if they don't come by rail, quite honestly, there's no other way, light rail included, there's no other way really of doing it.
Thank you. I want to move on to a slightly different question. So one from Paul Tetlow. How do we tackle the continued development of housing developments which are not well served by public transport?
Mm-hmm.
Go on, Rosie.
I think there's some Green Lines. There's a Green Lines report which I didn't author, but will give a shameless plug to, which is called Build Up, about kind of gentle densification, but also about, it is concerning if we're thinking about this approach to kind of new town development. It's so much harder, we know, to get the public transport mode share up if we're developing houses in that way. And so I think it's just really important when we're talking about reforms to the NPPF, which we're currently seeing, just to bear in mind as we're developing how that will have an impact on how people who will live in these new homes will get around, because it's our most emitting sector. It's something that we really need to consider. We're interested in exploring a kind of planning test that's like a no net traffic growth test, so that when we're looking at where we build new housing developments, we bear that in mind, because it can often not be well connected between these planning and transport decisions. So it's certainly something that we need to look at and continue thinking about.
Thank you. And Gary?
I was just going to say that obviously when the transport needs to be available, when people move houses, it's an ideal opportunity for those people to be changing travel habits. And I wonder if there's an extension of Jim's idea regards the carbon card, the climate card, whether housing providers could provide the card as part of the incentive for moving into that new estate as a test to see how that influences how they choose to behave. If there's a lot of talk of sunk costs in there. Somebody has a car, basically the expense of buying and insuring the car is the majority of the cost. If you got a climate card as part of purchasing a house, that is a sunk cost that maybe means you're more likely to use that card going forward as well. So I just wanted to float that as a concept.
Yeah, it's a great point. And of course, the house building community tends to look for young families as their target market. And it's for young people that car use, car travel is just so expensive. I mean, I know we've got a challenge here with public transport fares, but you know, for young people, car insurance is incredibly expensive, and it's going up at, you know, rates that well exceed rail fare increases. So I think it's a great opportunity to come in with something like that. Thanks for the idea. Great.
That's great. And David Goddard, can I?
Go on, Michael.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is really key, and look, thank you for the question on this, because yes, we've had 5 transport bills with this new government, but this is perhaps the most important of all to be addressed, really. You know, and as has been mentioned, it would be fantastic if we quadruple funding for buses by sorting out fuel fees, but it's not much use if we continue to build in the way we are. And I think there's a balance between being very, very encouraged by vision-led, being in the language of the BPF, and certainly being encouraged by Department for Ministry of Housing and Local Governments and DFT, the way that they're working together at the moment, that the noises are promising. But I think we do, as a sector, we need to balance optimism and support with vigilance. And I think I'll do a bit of macro first, but a big picture first, and then a bit of detail on the things. The macro, I think, if I may put in a word for John Reed and Smart Growth UK's narrative around this at the same time, we have a unique situation in the UK. And we make European comparisons all the time. They've read books from cities and transport for new homes. Lots of us in the sector will say, in X, Y, Z, French, German city, you can get to the centre of town in under half an hour. Comparisons with the UK are disastrous by comparison. But there are a variety of reasons for that. And I think it's very well worth bearing in mind the cultural context we have in this country, which goes back to the late 19th century. It goes back to, roads paved with good intentions by good folk building garden cities, and your William Morrises and your Ebenezer Howards, and the English kind of cultural attachment to our house in the country, and that whole thing, our little piece of land, even land rights. I have people with 3 acres and a cow. History of land rights. This all this stuff. We all want our patch of land, and that's something which is quite a tough nut to crack. You skip on to 2024. And a lot of people still do like the idea, 2020 of fleeing the cities to the country, going to that tranquil spot, and having that kind of semi-detached house. Where now, in many parts of the country, there's a minimum requirement of parking spaces, which is bedrooms -1. That's it. For a 4-bedroom house in Norfolk, required parking spaces is 3 parking spaces. So that's kind of the macro zooming into today. It's a very unique situation we have in the UK. So I think we need to be on top of this issue constantly as a sector. So then to get into some of the specifics, if you like, it certainly needs to come down to funding. So there's a case for transport funding to be capital funding for new developments rather than too much dependent upon revenue funding. And Section 106, certainly there's a case for that to be applied flexibly, because we've just seen last week a fantastic report from the Economics Foundation, RTPI, Royal Planning Institute, who we had a planning roundtable with, recently put out a brilliant report as well, really making the case that over the last decade, new developments have just locked in that car dependency. And hence why I say we need to be vigilant, supportive vigilant. If Section 106 isn't applied flexibly, then it locks in that standard process of just expanding sprawl. So if we can make that variable, we want to make changes, these current changes that are proposed in the NPPF, then that would be helpful. And then within the NPPF, although we've all put in our consultation responses, the emphasis on the need for transport sustainability isn't really as strong as it might be. Section 9 in that needs much greater emphasis on transport sustainability. And then there's also a case on roads. So when you have new developments, when new roads are adopted, often it's done at a stage which is effectively too soon. So public transport isn't embedded. So driving is embedded into those new developments because the road adoption process comes before people have got those public transport networks in. So you may then put in a retrospective bus routes, or you may put in a segregated cycle lane, but it's too late by then. So actually, there needs to be a case from DfT to guide local highway authorities actually not to adopt those roads until the last minute, till that public transport is embedded. So there's quite a lot of detail in there. It's, go back to the encouraging side of things. It really is great to hear vision-led described in the NPPF, but we do need to see what that actually looks like. Building on brownfields, fantastic. But really, I think to tie those things together, I think it's important that we think very positively, embrace urban living, because very much the case for rail. The key to rail is the sustainability side, like it's the answer to climate emergency. So is urban living. Good urban, medium-rise living has to be part of that future. It simply has to be. So, I really think it's worth looking at a situation in 2024 where living in London is extraordinarily expensive. Skip back 100 years, it was very, very cheap, and there was slum clearance going. We've got ourselves in a slightly curious situation in the UK. So we really need to put that emphasis on successful, happy urban living, medium rise, light rail networks, big picture with a lot of vigilant approaches to the detail. It's a lot in there.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm keen to bring Georgia into picking out a couple of questions that are related to your presentation. Should we be considering an environmental case as an addition to the 5-case model, or would this segregate it rather than embed it? And that's from George Rogers. And also, maybe you go first, and other people might consider this as well. Should we be looking at equity effects as part of socioeconomic benefits when making the case for rail?
Thank you very much. I'll start with the first question. That is a really great question about the environmental case as a standalone sort of case in business cases. So that's very much been on my radar as a possible option. I think for me, there are sort of two key aspects to it. So on the one hand, we have environmental benefits as something that is worth pursuing per se, and so we should be looking at how do we make sure that we deliver infrastructure projects, particularly rail projects, because they deliver environmental benefits, and not, as it may happen with infrastructure projects of different sorts, not despite the CO2 emissions that happen as part of construction, etc. So how to bring the environmental benefits and the environmental case as a standalone thing to the forefront, and on the other hand, how do we connect those environmental benefits to the wider socioeconomic benefits? So to go back to the question, and more specifically, I think adding an extra environmental case to the business case model is very much an option to make sure that this aspect is brought to the forefront. What we need to ask ourselves, and I think you capture that in the question itself, is like we need to make sure, we need to also make sure that it's not segregated. So if we do add a separate environmental case, how do we make sure that this remains linked to the wider strategic case and wider socioeconomic benefits? So I don't have an answer to this yet, but it's very much something that's worth exploring and discussing further. I'll make a quick start on the sort of equity effects question. Obviously, it's a very important question, and it's a crucial part of socioeconomic benefits. Whether there will be a dedicated place for this in my research, I wouldn't be able to answer as yet, just because obviously the research question needs to have a certain specificity, and we'll need to make sure that that there will be plenty of different socioeconomic benefits that we could discuss. We just need to make sure that it's that the paper is tailored to the relation with environmental benefits.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add on that one? Should we crack on? Just to say as well, I've been told we can run a little bit beyond the 1 o'clock, go to 1:30, but if anyone on the panel has any issues, let me know. But in the meantime, Stephen Joseph wanted to ask, in response to Jim's presentation, about whether a climate ticket would only be a niche offering to commuters around English cities that would require extra funding and might detract from the actual original aim from it.
Yeah, and I'll put a short answer to this, Martin. Thanks for bringing it to attention. There's no doubt that if you produce something like a monthly pass for rail travel and public transport travel, incidentally, I mean, the backbone of this is rail, but clearly you'd want to integrate across the modes, then you're going to attract commuters because they pay through the nose. I mean, they pay a lot of money. Season tickets are a great money earner for the rail network, and that's why they've been so troubled by the impact of COVID. So inevitably, you're going to attract commuters. The real challenge is getting at people who would otherwise not think about using the train. So this has got to be part of a much wider effort to make rail travel attractive. Michael and others have mentioned, things like accessible trains and all the rest of it. You have to overcome these problems. Those are part of it. But so is our horrendous fare system, which nobody trusts. So putting this in, I think, and promoting it through completely different ways to the way things have been promoted for rail travel is the way forward. I mean, there's a related question about, well, isn't this really, since you're saying it's difficult in London, isn't this really for the rest of the country? And in a sense, yes, it could be. I mean, it could be just for the north of England and the Midlands and the southwest, for instance. And it would work tremendously well. And it will also be a great prompt for all those, both local rail services and interregional services, of which the most neglected in the country is the cross-country network, which irritates people probably more than any, i.e. it's not London. So it's doing something for them.
Great, thank you. Gary?
It's kind of a question for Jim, really. Do you feel that there might be a specific advantage to targeting it on an age demographic? So, the younger people trying to access education and employment for the first time, whether something like the climate card targeted at them might be more acceptable in the times of like financial challenges?
Yeah, I should have mentioned this. Clearly you'd have a family of these things. So I mentioned the standard product, but as we've done with travel cards on rail, you can have young people's, you can have senior, older people's, you can have family versions. I mean, in Germany, I think they've also got a armed forces travel card. I think we've had those in the past. Yeah, so you can target them. You could have a seeking work out of employment kind of incentive to use these. And, they do really overcome a cost barrier, particularly for people entering the labour market or needing to travel further, or there's an increasing trend in rail towards more education trips, particularly to higher and further education. I mean, these are areas which really make it possible. And of course, you can tie it in. Germany's done all these things where employers offer you a discount if you travel in by using this kind of facility. So, yeah, I mean, I've mentioned the standard price and the analysis is pretty simply based on that. But absolutely, yes, good idea.
Michael?
Yeah, just to say that's fantastic, Jim, and extremely supportive, and appreciate the level of detail as well. Because I mean, I should plug fourth recommendation from our Fair Future report, which is on exactly this, but in less detail. And the recommendation we made was to try it in one region. So try it in the north in the first instance, and then if that succeeds, move to the south. And we've got an opportunity potentially with the network from Manchester, and for the north as well. Extremely supportive. So yeah, I mean, I think there are other trials going on which are arguably slightly less successful on fares than 16, necessarily no names certain fares. So worth trying this in the first instance and then seeing if it's something which could be rolled out. So I mean, the case that's made in terms of behaviour changes is significant, and I think it can be afforded. That's my question.
Thank you. Moving on to another question, and one from Kate Freeman, and this is about tourism and in particular capacity for luggage. Is anyone investigating capacity for passengers' luggage on rail compared to the convenience of hand luggage on air travel? Now, I'm not sure whether this is looking at the inconvenience of taking luggage on planes, or what angle? But Rosie.
Not specifically in comparison to air travel, but as part of this work, we've engaged with Wheels for Wellbeing, and we talked about the need for more flexible space in rolling stock in the future. That's something that Wheels for Wellbeing is keen on. And I think it's quite interesting as we see more leisure travel on trains. We have more of a pressure on luggage compartments, and a co-benefit of having more flexible space is that you can also enable users who have wheelchairs or mobility aids. There's more storage for those people, as well as for people who have more luggage requirements. And so I think looking into kind of more flexible space in rolling stock for the future is a potential solution there.
Thank you. No one else wants to come in on that one? And
just to say, I mean, as a small piece, I think it's a really interesting question, actually. I'm glad to bring this up, and I absolutely concur with Rose's response. Just there was a conversation recently in relation to comparisons between rail and airfares, and there was a suggestion that certain airfares with well, the cut to the chase. The point is that the airlines often put add-ons for luggage, basically, and as Rosie described, the travel patterns are changing. Well, there's a market is significantly a high proportion. There's almost a case that could be made for rail fares to be lower in the first instance, but then for luggage, optional luggage add-ons to be incorporated. But it's something which certainly needs to be addressed, and it's been a very mixed picture for a long time. So rolling stock has simply overhead luggage has been completely insufficient. Others it's improved. So I think it's very, very important. Thank you for bringing that up.
There's one particular one that I noticed on that, which is on Great Western on DWR, that when they brought in new trains, they banned people being able to take surfboards on the train. So you can't now take your surfboard to go down to Devon and Cornwall in the summer, which seems bonkers to me. But anyway, another question then from Friends of Carrington Moss. Is anyone looking at the case for rail freight?
If I may, yeah,
Michael.
we certainly are, yes, and quite proactively, I should say. Campaign for Better Transport for quite some time. We had a program called Freight on Rail, that's what it says in the tin, and we're working with the main freight operating companies, unions, and it's a fresh version of that. Effectively, it's a vital time to be doing so. And to come back to the intro to the session. It's a size at the moment for rail in terms of rail reform, the way the railways are organised, and we know from meetings with our stakeholder partners there that the rail freight operating companies and the unions are very, very keen that we help them address the case for supporting rail freight, but also how rail freight is incorporated into the union. There's a sense that at the moment it's not planned to be incorporated into reform, but in due course it will have to be. And indeed, there's a real risk of there's a most shift revenue support subsidy which the freight sector has had. There's a risk of that running out, not being substantially improved, is what they need. We have addressed, I mentioned in my presentation, I know there was a lot in there, but did include a couple of bits on rail freight. We know that there are specific cases that need support. For example, under £100 million would unlock an area called Dollars More, where the freight gauge would enable freight from Europe to get right the way through the UK and make a huge difference. There's Ely Area Capacity Enhancement Plan, it's a strategic rail freight interchange, which has just been sitting waiting for something to happen to it for a long, long time. There are good things happening in the meantime. For example, London Gateway is just significantly expanded its through freight capacity and carrier capacity. But yeah, there's a case that needs to be made, and at the moment it's not being made strongly enough. 75% rail freight growth target by 2050, which came in last year. That's quite good, but it's not sufficient. So short answer to that question is very much so, and keep an eye on the work that we're doing over the next few weeks and months.
Thank you.
And not to be upsetting anybody, but the busiest freight route in the country is the West Coast Main Line. And whatever you think of the chaotic way HS2 has been implemented and its cost, that actually is the big opportunity to massively increase rail freight flows in the country. So we need to hang on to that, I think, because as Michael said, massive benefits and a huge need.
Yeah, I totally would agree with that. On a slightly different topic, Chris Burrett asks about capacity on the network, as you were just alluding to, but whether we can do more with dynamic pricing. So he was asking about that with regard to ticketing, I think. And I think I would go further than that. So we've got some elements of dynamic pricing already. Is there enough? Can we do more with it? And also, is there a place for reservation-only trains, or do you think we should always keep the turn up and go element of the network?
Because dynamic and surge pricing is probably best known as being a modern way of getting a taxi, isn't it? Basically, not to name them. I mean, so Uber is a kind of dynamic pricing. The longer distance train operators tend to do it. They're really copying the airline model. It took them a long time to realize that was the way to do it and to maximize load factors, basically. So Treasury likes this stuff because it means you get a lot of revenue for the cost of running a train. Do people like it? Open question, I think.
Yeah, we're talking quite a lot about this in our quarterly steering groups with the stakeholders in this space, and exactly as Jim says, Treasury like it. But we would make the case for it to be used if it meant that the fares could actually come down more frequently. And for example, you sold off fares at the last minute that they're affordable, because actually the public do value the turn up and go, and they do value consistency. And there's a real sense of kind of injustice when somebody's paid £20 a seat and somebody's paid £200, a seat to seat, arguably. So it's direct pricing it's a very live topic that's being used not just in air and passenger travel now, but all other sectors. Some restaurants are even using it's and of course Uber is, as Jim highlights, is probably many people's most familiar engagement with it, because the price shoots up and and that people don't like that. So I think it's important to get it right. It could be used to good benefit, but I'm fair to say if the Treasury like it for the reasons they like it, so that's not necessarily suggesting that it's benefiting the public as much as it could be.
Rosie.
We have been looking at where dynamic pricing can be used, and honestly, we were finding that by and large, train operating companies are using dynamic pricing. We found it hard to suggest something that they weren't doing with capacity in terms of dynamic pricing. Interestingly, Louise Hay said recently at the Transport Select Committee that she'd been to Dijon, where they use dynamic pricing for parking spaces based on air pollution levels. And so I think there is potentially a way for dynamic pricing to be used in kind of an environmental or an air pollution lens that could be quite interesting. And I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
Been to Whitby a couple of times in the last year, and Michael mentioned dynamic pricing at restaurants. Fish and chips in Whitby is about £12 in the winter, but pushing £20 in the summer. That's dynamic pricing for you. Go on, Gary.
I was just going to add, I mean, not to forget, I would imagine on this call, we're all rail users. We're probably confident rail users. There'll be a significant portion of the population who haven't been on a train for many, many years, if at all. I think anything to do with pricing, it's just got to be easy. If it's expensive, that's going to be a barrier to people. If it's complicated to navigate the system for buying a rail ticket, it's going to be a barrier for some people. And I think whilst we think about these sort of technological solutions to these issues, we need to not lose sight of the fact it's just got to be simple. As Michael said, people don't like thinking the person sitting next to them paid more than them, but at the same time as that, at the end of the day, they just want to be able to access the service as simply as they can. So I would be an advocate personally of simple is better. Don't make it competitive. Don't reward people that have got the time to navigate the system.
Yeah, definitely agree with that one. Moving on to something slightly different, to pick up something that Gary spoke about when you were speaking before we started the Q&A bit. The rail network is fundamentally about people and bringing people together, shaping people's lives, accessing opportunities and stuff. What more can we do to enfranchise and engage people with their transport services, and what more can the rail industry and government do to make sure that decisions are focused around people's lives. Or nothing.
Well, we can't make them sit in on our seminar, can we? So we've got to do better than that.
I'm sure you've got some more, Gary.
Well, I wasn't going to hog the floor. I mean, obviously, from our point of view, community rail provides the opportunity for that joined upness between the service provider and the community that's going to benefit from the service. And our recent report, social value report, identified for every £1 spent on community rail, you get £17.89 worth of social value. I mean, that's quite a phenomenal amount and speaks volume for the opportunity to just bring people together, widen access to employment, education, healthcare, recreation, all those things that the opportunity to use the train provides to people. But I think if we continue to see it as a service which is provided to a community rather than for a community, then I think there's always going to be a barrier there. So I think it's reframing that that understanding about what transport does for people. And I think sometimes we're too, as I said earlier, we lose track of the fact it's not just about getting people from A to B, it's about all the opportunities it provides for them.
Thank you. Michael was next.
Jobs. I think jobs is absolutely key. And if we come to this moment of reform, there's a real risk that the railway family, if you like, has been fragmented for a long time, and the workforce is aging. There have been driver shortages for a long time. There's going to be a real case that could be made, actually, to create an industry, a new industry under GBR, and where people have secure jobs for a long period of time, and there's a restored sense of pride in the work that they do, and that's really withered away. And commuter rail networks, to a large extent, have filled a very important gap in terms of that human side engagement, actually looking after stations. The network is vital, but you know, it'd be even better if commuter rail network could work alongside a GBR which has a greater sense of unanimity, a greater sense of pride. The reality is that there's not a sense that working in the rail industry, working on the railways is really a viable long-term career for a lot of people in the way that it has been. And I mean, Andy Burnham has done very well for his first agenda to be public transport and his second one to be skills and jobs, effectively. Linked to that public transport agenda, and I think there's an opportunity here, which hopefully the Secretary of State will grasp, to really actually excite people about the prospects of working the railway again. And I think that in itself, that has it's kind of virtuous cycle that have the knock-on effects of people finding using the network more agreeable, and they know who to talk to. They don't sort of have some sort of sense of is that a train operating company? Is it Network Rail? Who is it? You know, that kind of that human side, working with, I hope very much with CRN on this. Yeah, so I think jobs is absolutely key, and it sort of on a cultural or socio-political level, I think that could cut through to some important questions, and you know, zooming right the way out, and the ways in which people feel disenfranchised, and the way things move politically, because they're looking for that sort of looking for that heart, that centre, that community, and that's at the moment it's not really there in the way that it could be as part of that professional railway family, I should say. So I think jobs is really, really key.
Thank you, and Rosie.
I was good to agree with what Gary and Michael said, but I think also in terms of local and regional leaders, as they start to be empowered, and we're going to see this trend of devolution definitely on the new government's agenda. And so, and we talked about Andy Burnham already, but I think, yes, that also links to this idea of community ownership, is that local and regional connection to public transport services. I know that when I was engaging on a bus report I wrote before, people really feel that with buses. Even if you aren't a bus user, you see a buses running, and it really contributes to the way you think about the place that you live. And I think people are starting to think that way about the train as well. You know, an idea that even if you don't get the train, you see it as representative of the community and the place that you live in, an important part of placemaking.
Yeah, interesting. And Georgia.
Thank you. Yeah, very much agree with what everyone has said. I was just going to add that we probably need to sort of decide how we want to think about rail and how we want to see the railway. If you know, it seems like the governments of all different colours have interpreted rail as a balance sheet that you need to you need to add to, and that you need to respect, but actually, I think is this how we want to think about rail, or is it about an essential sort of fundamental public good, public service, the same level of health services, for example? Because, you know, just to go back to something like Gary said earlier, you know, rail is not a way to move people from place A to place B. It's about how people shape their lives and their opportunities, and it's much more fundamental in people's lives. So it's probably that sort of mindset shift that we need to see.
I think we should also remember, if I can just briefly add, that we used to see some quite imaginative marketing and advertising campaigns at a national level. I mean, this is prehistory, folks. This is before 1990s, so some of you don't even know about this world, where you could advertise and promote. So Intercity was a big brand. I'm not sure it would work again, but you know, and it was stylish and it was attractive and it was ours, you know. But that could come back. We've had the whole thing fragmented. We've had 25 franchises and a bunch of open access operators all trying to say, no, it's me, but it isn't. It's a national network.
Yeah, that's definitely a good thought. And then, I guess following on from that, almost, Lisa asks, what rail reforms would the panel like to see in the forthcoming rail bills? Gary, straight in.
Well, no, thank you, Lisa. You've reminded me that I meant to mention these earlier, so I do appreciate it. We've been working on sort of 5 key policy recommendations that we're going to be putting forward in the next few days. I won't read them verbatim, but to give you a flavour, we're talking about how rail reform and transformation should be used to bring modal integration to the fore. We've already discussed that. How all partners with an interest in rail and sustainable travel must work together. It shouldn't be an option. Local communities must be directly engaged, the point I've been making throughout, and listened to when we're designing integrated transport solutions, and fundamentally that the necessary resources to make all those things happen need to be in place.
Thank you. Clear agenda there. Apologies. And anyone else, what would you like to see in the forthcoming rail bills?
They come in. We will have a rail reform paper coming out soon as well, and that includes commitment to devolution. So I think devolution is really key to make this work, and it's working. We're always using London as a case study. Obviously, Manchester is the next in line, and they're looking at the Northern and suburban rail networks in the next few years, which is great. So really talk about islands and bridges in terms of connecting the country up. We need to really see that devolution is effective. We think, and we've mentioned rail freight already, and we think it's vital that rail freight is incorporated in rail reform in a central and fundamental way. And we believe there's a case to look at the concession model, which is used on London Overground and Merseyrail, effectively, where you have a fares and timetable set by GBR, by the public body, but there is a place for private operation potentially under the bonnet, if you like, making the best use of that opportunity. And indeed, we need to see, as part of it, we need to see a target. So we need to see a modal shift target as part of that growth target.
Thank you. And Rosie.
Yes, unsurprisingly, I also back the idea of there being a modal shift target. And as we've heard, we're likely to see that as a rail growth target as part of the rail reform. I'm also interested in the devolution piece, and specifically how we can have Great British Rail and the franchising of buses regionally be used as an opportunity to do better integration and better coordination in terms of routes and timetabling between bus operators and train operators, or through Great British Rail rather. And so I think that's a really interesting opportunity for rail reform. And I'm also interested in exploring what a green climate and nature duty for Great British Rail, so public duty, could look like. And that might do better consultation when we're thinking about kind of infrastructure, and so that we're feeding some of George's work. But I think there's also something to be looked at there.
Thank you. And there's another question from Connected Cities. Does the panel think that there are lessons to be learned from the South Wales Metro? So the South Wales Metro is about rejuvenating some of the core Valleys lines predominantly to the north of Cardiff and take them under the infrastructure and under a separate ownership and develop it all in one go, and then develop some tram lines off the back of that. Jim, off you go.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great lessons from it. I mean, one is that that proposition had a champion, a really strong champion who would just not let go of it. You know, looked at a place he clearly cared hugely about, and said, well, this has got to change. I mean, it was visionary, and it's just stuck with it. And those people are rare, and without it, things don't happen. So that's not particularly helpful, because I actually go looking for these people, but that was a characteristic of what made this possible, because there were an awful lot of people saying, well, you can't do that, you know, that won't work, you know, all that kind of negative stuff. So it was somebody based in the territory who had the vision for that place. And we're not terribly good at thinking forward 20, 30 years, which I'm afraid is the kind of timescale you've got to think about. So find those people and nurture them.
Michael.
Yeah, I would say it's a great question. Many lessons to be learned, exactly as Jim described in terms of long-term thinking. Also, a couple of key points. It's fully electric. You know, East West Rail it's been given the go-ahead in the budget, you know, officially, but it's only electric in parts. You know, and there's a lot of kind of, we can get away with battery chains here and there, and that's very short-term thinking in that regard. So South West Metro fully electric, and accessibility is looking fantastic as well. So yeah, it's certainly a fantastic role model to have, and you know, a cause for great celebration and optimism at this point.
Yeah, and following on Jim's point then about having a champion, are there any other areas where you can see something kind of developing along a similar way? Is there someone pushing a particular agenda that you can see in 20 years' time, something similar might happen?
Just, I mean, West Yorkshire Mass Transits, Tracy Braben certainly is fully behind that, and sure, that Leeds has been promised a tram many times over the years. The last time it was to Darling, that's in 2004, along with many other lines. But this seems like the real deal, if slightly expensive at this point than it needs to be, and also importantly because it's a grassroots project. It's West Yorkshire Combined Authority developing it, and champions are very much local, and that could be really transformational. It could be a really sort of defining moment for Leeds and West Yorkshire.
I've just been doing some work on Northwest England, and while I have great support for the city mayors and so on, the interesting thing to me were the many places in, call it Lancashire, which are really struggling, seriously struggling, and they're beyond Greater Manchester. They're not in the Merseyside either, and you'll know all these places. Most of them begin with the letter B or maybe W. And they're places really on their uppers, and they do have a rail network, but the focus is never really been placed on, well, how do we improve things in these places? The focus has always been on, well, what do we need to do in Manchester or Liverpool, or the connection between the two? Yeah, but what about Blackburn and Bolton and Wigan and St Helens and Warrington and Southport and all these places where really, I mean, they're all on the rail network, but what are their needs? And their needs really are to have something like, I mean, forget the scale problem, like people in Southeast England have, a rail network, a public transport network. So when the worst happens, which is the once an hour train doesn't turn up, there's some other way of making the journey. I mean, it's very basic stuff. And that area, so great to have devolution, but don't forget in devolution, there are a lot of places that don't naturally fall under the mayoral combined authorities.
That's an excellent point. And I was thinking about asking, when we were speaking about devolution briefly earlier, about what happens when you get to the boundaries between different devolved areas, and are we looking at how to integrate that, and what the kind of ticketing implications of that are, and service implications, where investment priority, all these kinds of questions. And it links to a point that someone else made in the chat, Roy made in the chat, about doesn't making the case for rail mean making that case everywhere outside Southeast England, where it already has kind of an inbuilt strong case and a larger kind of groundswell of business providing investment in and a voice in addition to government there. So I totally echo that. I think that pretty much, unless anyone's got any closing remarks, brings us to the end of the webinar. And I think that's a good and compelling place to wrap up with. So there's a really strong case for rail and investing in rail, developing rail, providing access to rail right across the country alongside all of the other means of getting around that we have. And it is fundamentally about accessing jobs, accessing leisure, developing people's lives, and making sure that rail is a core part of communities and people's lives that's helping to facilitate that. And I think all of the things that we've been speaking about form part of that picture to make a strong, compelling case that has wide socioeconomic benefits and environmental benefits. And that case needs to be heard. So thank you all very much for taking part in this. I found it really interesting. Hope you have too. Thank you for joining us online, watching, listening to this, and for your questions. And